What do you think causes depression? Is it poverty or unfulfillment? Does it have anything to do with not achieving a particular goal or dream we set out to achieve for ourselves? Or is it much deeper than that? What really causes depression? Is depression even real? Or is it just a psychological construct? Well, there's no perfect explanation as to what really causes depression. It cannot be poverty, as we've seen really happy poor people in different parts of the world. Neither can we say it is unfulfillment, as there are countless unfulfilled people that are not depressed. So what should we say is the main cause of depression? In my opinion, I think there's no single reason for depression. Anybody can get depressed, and they could also overcome depression if they really wanted to. But what if everything in their immediate environment is a cause for their depression? What then do you think is the option they have? I know that when you think about depression on a grand scale, the first place that comes to mind is North Korea, because of its authoritarian leader and hereditary dictatorship, where freedom is not an option, neither is free speech. But have you ever heard about a country called Turkmenistan? I guess not. So sit tight and watch this video to the end as I give you a brief history of Turkmenistan and some heart-wrenching stories of how a previously flourishing country now ranks high on the list of the most depressed countries in the world, beyond continental lines. Turkmenistan is located in Central Asia and was once part of the ancient civilizations of Margiana and Bactria, often known as Bactria Margiana, which flourished with early agricultural communities around 2000 BCE. It later became part of the Achaemenid Empire, under the Persian Empire, and saw influence from various Persian and Central Asian cultures. The region became an important hub during the Silk Road era, connecting trade routes between China, the Middle East, and Europe. Cities like Merv were prominent centers of culture and trade. In the 7th century AD, Turkmenistan was invaded by the Arabs, who introduced Islam, which remains the dominant religion today. The area fell under Mongol rule in the 13th century when Genghis Khan's forces swept through the region, followed by the Timurid and other Central Asian empires. By the 16th century, the Turkmen people had developed a strong tribal society, which persisted into the modern era. They were known for their semi-nomadic lifestyle and were only loosely governed by external powers. In the late 19th century, however, the Russian Empire expanded into Central Asia, and Turkmenistan was incorporated as part of the Russian Protectorate in 1881 after the Battle of Göktepe. Turkmenistan became part of the Soviet Union in 1924 as the Turkmen Soviet Socialist Republic. During this period, the region was modernized, but Soviet control suppressed traditional practices and imposed centralized control over the economy and politics. Eventually, Turkmenistan gained independence from the Soviet Union on October 27, 1991. The first president, Saparmurat Niyazov, also known as Turkmenbashi, father of all Turkmen, established an authoritarian regime, creating a cult of personality. His rule was marked by isolationism and state control over all sectors, meaning from being oppressed by a tyrant empire before independence to having a tyrant ruler after independence. The irony of life, huh? After Niyazov's death in 2006, Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov came to power and maintained an authoritarian rule while slightly opening the country to international relations and making modest economic reforms. His regime, however, continued strict control over political life, media, and civil rights. In 2022, Serdar Berdimuhamedov, the son of Gurbanguly, became the president, marking a dynastic transition of power. His leadership has been seen as a continuation of his father's policies, with a focus on maintaining stability and tight government control over the economy and society. When thinking about the most depressing countries in the world today, Turkmenistan often flies under the radar. However, behind its secretive borders lies a nation dealing with a myriad of issues, from authoritarian rule to severe economic hardship. While the concept of a depressing country can be subjective, Turkmenistan's combination of political oppression, isolation, and socioeconomic struggles places it high on the list. In a place where there is virtually no freedom of speech, media, or assembly, the people of Turkmenistan live in constant fear of surveillance and punishment. The government keeps a tight grip on all communication, monitoring everything from phone calls to internet use. According to Reporters Without Borders, Turkmenistan consistently ranks near the bottom in terms of press freedom, often in the same category as North Korea. Ogulsapar Muradova, a journalist working with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, was a prominent human rights activist in Turkmenistan. In 2006, she was arrested by the authorities for her critical reporting on the Turkmen regime and her involvement with the human rights organization, Turkmen Helsinki Foundation. Muradova was charged with possession of weapons, a claim widely seen as fabricated. After being subjected to a closed trial, where no proper legal procedures were followed, she was sentenced to 6 years in prison. Just a few months later, her family was informed of her death in custody. When her body was returned, her relatives reported seeing severe signs of torture, including head injuries, bruises, and swelling. The Turkmen government denied responsibility, stating she had died of natural causes, but human rights organizations worldwide condemned her death as a result of mistreatment and called for accountability. Her death highlighted the severe repression of free speech and the deadly risks faced by critics of the regime. Another key factor contributing to Turkmenistan's depressing atmosphere is its isolation from the rest of the world. With borders tightly controlled and a severe lack of interaction with neighboring countries or international trade partners, the people of Turkmenistan are essentially cut off from global society. Foreign travel is restricted, and only a privileged few are allowed to leave the country. This isolation leads to a lack of opportunities for young people. There are few educational advancements, job prospects, or chances for upward mobility. With a state-controlled economy that prioritizes vanity projects over public welfare, many Turkmen citizens struggle just to meet basic needs. The Ashgabat International Airport, a project intended to highlight Turkmenistan's wealth, became infamous after reports surfaced that the multi-billion-dollar facility was nearly empty, with flights departing only to a few select destinations. Despite its impressive structure, the airport symbolized the disconnect between the government's lavish spending and the people's actual needs. Although Turkmenistan is rich in natural gas reserves, the wealth is largely concentrated in the hands of the elite. This leaves the average citizen struggling with economic uncertainty, inflation, and limited access to resources. Despite the country's vast natural wealth, corruption has siphoned off the majority of these benefits, leaving public services like healthcare and education in dire states. In recent years, food shortages have become a serious issue in Turkmenistan. Bread lines and rationing are commonplace, with the government tightly controlling food distribution and limiting how much citizens can buy. While the ruling class enjoys luxurious lifestyles, many ordinary people face hunger and deprivation. In 2020, a video leaked online showing a massive line of people waiting to buy bread.
Bread lines are new in Turkmenistan. In the northern city of Dashaguz, between 600 and 700 people arrived early in the morning to buy bread or even flour. Fights broke out.
Despite official claims that the country was doing well economically, the footage sparked international concern and outrage, as it showed that Turkmenistan's citizens were far from the prosperity the government projected. Despite the government's attempts to hide the truth, these stories occasionally make their way to the outside world, exposing the stark contrast between the official narrative and the citizens' struggles. Under Niyazov's rule, bizarre cultural policies were enacted, such as banning ballet, circuses, and opera, which were deemed unnecessary to Turkmen identity. The government also promoted an almost cult-like veneration of the president, forcing citizens to read the former leader's book, the Runama, which was integrated into school curriculums and even used in driving tests. Berdimuhamedov has continued this practice of enforcing arbitrary and oppressive rules. In an attempt to glorify his rule, he has authored multiple books and has been depicted as a sportsman, musician, and even a horse rider in the state media. While the government focuses on these bizarre displays of grandeur, the people suffer under a lack of cultural freedom, unable to express themselves or engage in artistic activities freely. A citizen who dared to organize a private cultural event that wasn't government-sanctioned was detained, and the event was shut down immediately. The government feared that even harmless gatherings could lead to dissent. This suppression of free thought and creativity contributes to a pervasive sense of helplessness and frustration among the population. Boris Shikmuratov was once a high-ranking Turkmen government official, serving as the country's foreign minister and later its ambassador to China. In the early 2000s, Shikmuratov became increasingly critical of President Sapir Murat Niyazov's dictatorial rule. After a failed coup attempt in 2002, Shikmuratov was accused of masterminding the plot and was subsequently arrested. In a televised confession, which many believe was coerced, he admitted to crimes he likely did not commit. He was sentenced to life imprisonment and disappeared into the Turkmen prison system. Shikmuratov's family and international observers feared for his life, given the brutal conditions in Turkmenistan's jails, and reports surfaced that he had died in custody under unclear circumstances. His body was never returned to his family, and Turkmen authorities have consistently refused to release information about his fate. His tragic end represents the regime's brutal crackdown on political dissent. On top of political oppression and economic hardship, Turkmenistan faces environmental challenges that exacerbate the country's dire situation. The Aral Sea, once one of the world's largest lakes, has mostly dried up due to poor water management and massive irrigation projects, particularly in neighboring Uzbekistan. Turkmenistan, which was dependent on the sea for fishing and agriculture, now suffers from the consequences of this ecological disaster, including severe dust storms and salinity in its soil. Ruguli Atakov, a devout Christian and pastor, faced severe persecution by the Turkmen government due to his religious beliefs. In Turkmenistan, religious freedom is highly restricted, and minority religious groups often face harassment and violence from the authorities. Atakov was arrested multiple times throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, with the government accusing him of distributing Christian literature and leading unregistered worship services. In 1999, he was imprisoned for refusing to renounce his faith, and his family reported that he was tortured during his time in jail. Although he was eventually released, Atakov's health deteriorated rapidly due to the abuse he endured in custody. He passed away shortly after his release, and his death is believed to be a direct result of the torture and poor prison conditions he faced during his time behind bars. Additionally, healthcare in Turkmenistan is severely underfunded, and many citizens struggle to access even basic medical services. With unreliable healthcare systems and poor living conditions, the life expectancy of the average citizen is much lower than in neighboring countries. In a report by Human Rights Watch, hospitals in rural areas were found to lack basic supplies, such as bandages and antiseptics. Citizens are often forced to pay bribes for medical treatment, adding another layer of hardship to their daily lives. Many people avoid seeking treatment altogether, knowing that the quality of care is so poor. Turkmenistan stands out as a deeply oppressive, isolated, and economically unequal nation. While the government promotes a facade of wealth and prosperity through state-run media and grandiose projects, the reality for most Turkmen citizens is one of hardship, fear, and suffering. The stories of breadlines, arbitrary detention, and cultural suppression paint a bleak picture of life in Turkmenistan. With little hope for reform under the current regime, Turkmenistan remains one of the most depressing countries in the world, a place where the government's control over every aspect of life leaves its citizens with few prospects for a brighter future. The lack of freedom, opportunity, and basic human rights in Turkmenistan makes it a stark example of how authoritarian rule can devastate a country's spirit and people. So it is worthy of note that there are levels to depression, and while life might seem to be difficult and filled with uncertainties, we should learn to be grateful for the little we have and the freedom we enjoy, as some people somewhere in the world were not even given a choice to decide what kind of life they wanted for themselves. And watch out for more of our videos beyond continental lines.